you ever had one of those moments where you stand up on a stage behind a microphone in a beautiful room with beautiful vistas in front of a large crowd of beautiful people, and all you can think is that I really should have peed? Me neither. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I spoke at a WCDR breakfast several years ago, and it was one of the highlights of anything I've done with my books. It was just a great group of people, and I'm thrilled to be part of this this extension in many ways of that. This is a real treat for me, and to be surrounded by so many great people. So thank you all. We've talked a lot today about small matters and big matters, matters of style and matters of approach, matters of publication and revision, matters of work. And I wanted to deviate from that a little bit and talk about life. Because we've all chosen something to whatever degree. We've chosen a life in books. We write, we read, we sell books, we review books. Some of us do all of those things. And it's a tremendously privileged place in a lot of ways. But living a life of the book is not... It has its ups and downs. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a week in the life. And I'm choosing a week entirely arbitrarily, in the manner of these speeches in which nothing is arbitrary and you pick something completely deliberately. I want to talk about the first week of April in my life. So the first week of April, I worked Monday to Thursday. I usually work Monday to Friday, but I had to take Friday off at the bookstore because I was leaving the country. So in those 4 days, I had a fairly serious conversation with my boss at the bookstore, which, kind of bummed me out. I was up all night, 2 nights, I think, finishing revisions on a book that's coming out this fall. I was late with 2 newspaper reviews. And when I say late, I mean spectacularly late. I think one of the books was actually published in the last season. So if it was yours, I'm very sorry. I received an email from someone wondering if I would act as an advisor for a short film that he was doing. He wanted me to advise him on the script and was willing to send a certified check. And I said yes. I received an email of a PDF of a short story that I wrote 15 years ago that is being published in an Ontario textbook for grade 10 students this spring. And that was thrilling. It was thrilling! I spoke to my publicist about blurbers for the next book. I talked to my agent about a proposal for the next novel. And on the Friday, I got on a plane for Scotland. Now, this was a big deal. I was invited to Scotland to teach creative writing for a foundation in the UK that runs writers' houses. This was a huge deal for me. I was just thrilled. To fly out, I flew out of Vancouver, and you'll appreciate this later on. I had to take the bus to the ferry terminal. I had to take the ferry across, so now we're looking at 2.5, 3 hours, and then the ferry to the airport. We have to check in 2.5 hours ahead of time. My flight was slightly late. I was in motion for about 24 hours. I arrived in Edinburgh with my duty-free and my carton of cigarettes, and the immigration man said, "Why are you coming to Scotland?" I said, "Well, I'm going to teach at a writer's house, and then I'm going to spend a week faffing about Edinburgh and doing some writing." "About this writer's house," he says, "have they filed the appropriate paperwork?" I said, "Hell if I know." "Well, they've got you in a spot of trouble, lad." A spot of trouble with UK immigration is apparently 4 hours in a small room, fingerprinting, being mugshotted, having a big pink file with your name on it for the Home Office, and ultimately being deported. And I got to Toronto 2.5 weeks early, which was not in the plan, but I'm here. And I got to Toronto, and the first day I was in Toronto, I sat down and I started a new short story. And the immigration experience was terrible, and, it's a story too. And that's what life is. It's ups and downs. You're talking movie deals one day, and you're getting a phone call from the bank wondering why you haven't paid your Visa card in 4 months the next. It's ironic when those two things happen back to back, but, it doesn't always work out that way. But we choose this life. We choose it out of love, and we choose it out of something that isn't, well, it's not rational, is it? Nobody writes for rational reasons. If we were rational people, we'd be golfing out there right now. I mean, let's face it. But there's something. And whether it's that movement of the pen across the page, whether it's that thought that gets you up in the middle of the night, whether it's the byline, whether it's the check, whether it's invitations to appear at places like this and stand on stages like this, we choose it because it brings us joy. It's hard. Sometimes it sucks. Let's face it, there's a lot of frustration to this. There's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of suckage. There's a heavy bass line. But you know what? There is so much joy in what we do that it carries you through. And we've talked about little things today, and I know I've spoken to people who have been really inspired by what they've heard. But if you take nothing else away from a day like today, take away the joy. Let it fill you. Because what we're doing is special. And my mother can't figure out why I'm not a lawyer. But you know what? This is special. This is sacred. The work we do, the love we have, is something that you can't describe, and it's only in rooms like this where you're with people who share it that you can even talk about it. There is so much joy in what we do, and I'm thrilled to share it with you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to open it up to questions, but thank you for having me.
But as a Scots person for many years, I apologize for Scotland sending you back.
I just have to say that if you're going to be held, questioned, and deported from a country, Scotland is a great place to have it happen from. I have no complaints in that regard whatsoever. They acquitted themselves very well.
What kind of advice can you give to those of us who are writing that don't have a literary agent yet? And it seems that so many agents are not accepting new material in the area we're writing.
No, I'm just write well, keep trying, and if you can, build yourself some sort of a public profile. I know that people hate hearing about that now, and that I don't mean like tweet a lot, but do something to get your name out there. Write. Get short stories published in little magazines. Write record reviews for your local free weekly. Write book reviews. Just make it so that if they're looking, if a query letter lands on their desks and they Google you, that the first thing that comes up isn't your Facebook page. Have a presence, and that's going to be the advice that at every stage in your career at this point is have a presence. But start before. Start when you have none and control it from the start. My.
I know, it's going to be a nice one, Rob. Do you think that working in a bookstore has helped make you a better writer?
Yes, absolutely.
How so?
I was an English student. Well, first I was a creative writing student, then I transferred into English because I wasn't fond of the way creative writing workshops were happening for me. And I was an English student, and I was the worst sort of English student. I was an insufferable third-year English student. The kind, who knows everything and knows he knows it. Yeah. I read Joyce. But I started working, and you're in a culture of that. You're in a culture where that's the norm, where people who read those books aren't real people. You know, they don't, their opinions don't count. And when you're swimming in that stew, you pick up the flavor. And I started working in the bookstore, and I brought that attitude with me. And then I realized, as I was watching people shop, they were getting more out of books than I was. They were choosing what they wanted to read. They were driven by desire. They were choosing what they wanted to read, and they kept coming back to read more. There was no hint of obligation to it, and there was nothing shameful about it. You know, I was reading fantasy when I was an undergrad, and there was always this sense of shame, because my friends would be talking about Georges Bataille, and I'm like, William Gibson fucking rocks, man. But working in a bookstore, you realize that it's the act, and people weren't reading crap. Like my impression was that if it wasn't on a curriculum, it was crap. But watching people read Barbara Kingsolver and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison, and you know, that was when Fall on Your Knees first came out, was in that time, and it was like, these are good books. I started reading things that I didn't have to read, and it opened my mind. It blew my mind in a very real way. But having the two things work together, because nothing prepares you for certainly being a reviewer, which helps with your own writing as well, but to look at a text objectively, like an English degree, if you do it right. So having those two things working hand in hand went really well. I hate to imagine what it would have been like if I had just stuck with the English degree and got a job at McDonald's. Actually, I hate thinking about that on so many levels.
You know, you rhapsodized about the joy of writing, but there's so much about writing that somebody said this morning that writing is work, and I didn't sort of get some of that from you. I got a sort of...
Oh, make no mistake, there are some shitty days. I mean, I think everybody in this room has them. But going back to my early bookstore days, you know, do what you love, and you'll never have to work a day in your life. It is work. There's no two ways about it. And if you're looking at making it a career, it's definitely work, and often it's work stacked on top of the work you do to pay the bills. But at the heart of it, there's just so much joy. Oh, I was thinking she was setting up someplace for me to stand behind for a little moment of privacy.
Rob, could you, in the absence of some further questions, could you just sort of explain to us how Bedtime Story evolved? What that... Could you just sort of, for the audience, give us a thumbnail of how that process went?
It was literally a dark and stormy night. No, really, Jessica, it was. This goes back, the gestation period for Bedtime Story was a long time. So this goes back probably to 2003, I think. And in Victoria, it rains a little bit in the fall. And it was one of those Novembers where you get 40 days of rain. And our house, old house, built in 1909 and not well built then, so there was water coming in from the top, from the bottom, and from all four sides, like pumping out the basement every hour and doing things with downspouts. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I'm not the world's most manly man. Not at all. And I was ill-equipped to deal with this. The only person less well-equipped to deal with this was my then wife, and she, partway through the weekend, left. We had a little kid. Our son Xander was 3, and the water had come up to such a level that it had blown the pilot light on the hot water tank and on the furnace. So there was no heat, there was no hot water. We had a 3-year-old, so she left, went up to her parents' place up island, and left me to do the manly thing around the house, which was fine. But because it required constant attention, I wasn't sleeping. So I would go out and do things with downspouts and water and get soaked and come in and dry off and read for an hour and then go out and do the same thing and repeat the process. And I was reading a Jonathan Carroll book called Bones of the Moon, which dealt with a father-son relationship. And I realized that I hadn't seen many father-son relationships in fiction that spoke to me, that, the sort of geeky, bookish, non-manly early 21st century man. So I thought, well, I'm going to write this book. And I sat down at my desk and I opened up my obligatory Moleskine notebook and I wrote 3 words. I wrote father, son, book. And within about 15 minutes, I had not an outline, but a schema for the book that would eventually become Bedtime Story. I knew it was going to be a book about fathers and sons. I knew it was going to be a book about a book that swallows its readers and that it doesn't do so by accident. I knew there were going to be 2 parallel storylines unfolding simultaneously, and I knew that it was going to be effortless to write. I was right on almost every count. It was a terrible writing process. It took me, as I mentioned in the workshop this afternoon, 25 tries to get into the book. And I'm like the first 40 pages, there are 25 separate versions of them. I played with point of view, I played with sequence, I played with characterization, I played with everything you could play with. And ultimately it took me 2 years to write the first draft of it. The first draft was 350,000 words, longhand, which I then had to type out. Many of you haven't seen my handwriting. This was not pleasant. So I typed it all out, and I discovered that even with a little wiggle room in my contract, 350,000 words probably not going to be acceptable to my publisher. So I winnowed it down to a nice, healthy 225, which I thought was fine. And we did, this was over the period of years. And then we brought it down to its current size, which is about 190,000 words, through the revision process. So I essentially threw out 2 novels worth of words. There's actually one character who almost disappears entirely from the final version, who I think I want to revisit. I'm not sure, but if you read Bedtime Story, there's a young woman the main character meets in a bookstore who's reading his book for a course. And in the first draft, they actually go on a date. And there's this long story about her roommate and some strange stuff that happened in the way that strange stuff happens in my books. It's just hinted at. And I've carried that with me since the first draft, and I'm thinking that she might return. Plus, she was cute.
Thank you for taking my question.
Thank you for asking it.
I was just wondering if you're ever afraid of reading a fiction when you are writing one, to be afraid of subconsciously using something from the other fiction. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it wasn't until now.
But are you now?
I'm going to have to give that some thought. I'm quite free in acknowledging that part of the inspiration for Bedtime Story was Jonathan Carroll's Bones of the Moon. Like I'm unequivocal about that. And I actually talked online with his editor publicly on Boing Boing, I think, after the book came out. And I'm like, Jonathan Carroll is someone who should get more attention than he gets. I'm not really worried because I'm stupid. No, it doesn't strike me as a concern because ideas, our stock in trade is ideas in many ways, but ideas are a fairly common commodity. It's what you do with them. If you gave the same idea to everyone in this room and said, go wild, you would come up with 200 different stories, completely different. There's been a lot of study about influence. Harold Bloom has written several books about influence, and I mean, it exists. I'm not worried about it.